conversation about economic and equity impacts of large disruptions. And today we're going to be focusing on two tools that have been used called the Interruption Cost Estimate Calculator and the Power Outage Economic Tool. If you're calling in, you can listen to the phone. If you can, please use the WebEx link to view the phone number to call in. That would be great. The link to join by computer is located on the registration form, and the event password is GRMG. This meeting will be recorded, and a staff summary report will be sent to the service list summarizing the discussion. While one or more commissioners or their staff might be present, no decisions will be made at this meeting. All attendees will be muted by default upon entry. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand or enter your question into the Q&A. The raise hand button is on the lower right and has a small hand icon in the participant box. The host will unmute you, and you'll have about 2 minutes to ask your question. After that, please lower your hand so that we know that you are not asking a second question. If you do have another question, please re-raise your hand. As we said, you can also enter your questions into the Q&A box, and we will go back and forth between verbal asking and answering questions in the Q&A. Peter, I think that you're okay having, are you okay having questions asked in midst of your presentation, or do you want them all held at the end?
Oh, that's okay. I'm happy to maybe take clarifying questions during the slides, and I only have 20 slides, and then I left plenty of room for just a discussion at the end on more substantive topics.
Great, thank you for clarifying that. If you'd like to follow along with the slides on your own computer, the event material should be at the bottom just before you have registered. The event material is available there. The materials will also be posted to our website just post this meeting. So this is the first of our workshops in the Track 5 schedule. We will be holding other workshops throughout the year, and this is the Track 5 schedule that was listed in our scoping ruling back in December. We will be looking at this topic as part of the economic and equity impacts of large disruptions. And I will move on. Our agenda, we will hear some opening remarks by Commissioner Shiroma. Afterwards, Pete Larson from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs will be giving us a presentation on the Interruption Cost Estimate Calculator, and followed by some Q&A. The Interruption Cost Estimator is a tool being used currently by utilities to estimate economic costs in response to short duration outages, less than 24 hours. Additionally, he will be discussing a tool that Lawrence Berkeley National Labs is also developing called the Power Outage Economic Tool, which focuses more on long duration outage economic impacts. We'll then have some closing remarks and adjourn for the evening. I'll start off by just giving some opening discussion after Commissioner Shiroma, but I will let Commissioner Shiroma speak.
Thank you, Roseanne, and good afternoon to all of our participants. I'm Commissioner Genevieve Shiroma. I'm the assigned commissioner to the Microgrids and Resiliency rulemaking. My pronouns are she and her. I'm pleased to join all of you today for this Value of Resiliency workshop. The rulemaking has issued 4 decisions since its inception in 2019. Addressing near-term and long-term barriers to microgrid deployment and commercialization, ranging from tariff updates, the authorization of a microgrid incentive program, improved access to electric system data to local governments, and enhancing the role of microgrids to support summer reliability. This workshop is informing track 5 of this proceeding, as Roseanne outlined. We're focusing on resiliency and the economic and equity impacts of large electric system disruptions. I want to thank our presenter, Dr. Peter Larson, who goes by Pete, from Lawrence Berkeley National Labs, who has joined us today to present on 2 of the resiliency tools that they have developed. Roseanne has mentioned these: the Interruption Cost Estimate Calculator, or ICE, and the Power Outage Economic Tool, or POET, or POET. Today's workshop will deepen our stakeholders' understanding and our understanding of these innovative tools and how they can inform the further strategic development of microgrids in California toward addressing equity. Finally, I want to thank our information technology, audio-visual staff, and our Microgrids Energy Division staff for putting on today's workshop, and especially you, Roseanne, for facilitating our discussion today. So back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Sharoma.
Roseanne, real quick before we proceed, we have a raised hand from Tam Hunt. Do we want to answer that now?
Sure.
Tam, you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon, Tam Hunt, GPI. A quick question on process. I put it in the chat also. Roseanne, this is for you, I think. Would you mind just taking a second to clarify how the work done in the RMWG will be reflected in track 5?
So the Resiliency and Microgrid Working Group, which is what Tam is referring to as the RMWG, was a series of working group meetings that we conducted last year through the summer for about 8 sessions discussing various topics on the value of resiliency as well. Those topics have informed the approach that we are taking as well, in particular, what the issues that we identified in our scoping ruling in December. It continues to inform the topics that we will be exploring in our workshops. Does that help, Tam? Okay, I can't hear you, but I think that's good. Let me go on by just saying that I'd like to begin this conversation by mentioning that what we're trying to do with these workshops, especially as we go into these metric kind of discussions, is what we're looking at is how to optimize grid investments while integrating resiliency into those into that planning process. And some of the problems that we're trying to address is how to ensure that we're addressing the appropriate amount of resiliency investment in the right places or locations that will benefit our most vulnerable populations. And how do we do that without causing undue burden on our most vulnerable populations? In other words, cost shifting. We can't know this answer without quantifying through measuring, assessing, and evaluating resiliency so that we know where to put that the best money in order to optimize those efforts. So we talked about this a little bit in our working group meetings, and that is the difference between quantification and the valuation of resiliency. And to quantify resiliency is to put numbers to the amount of risk reduction of a given measure. And to value resiliency is to understand these numbers in terms of human impact. How much is the risk reduction worth relative to other solutions? So I'm using these as the background thinking so that you can keep that in mind as we go along and listen to some of the tools that our national labs has been developing to bring a quantification to resiliency that we can then translate into our value. I'm going to turn it over to you, Pete.
Great. And I think, okay, there we go. So thank you so much to the CPUC, Commissioner Shiroma, Julian, Roseanne, and all the IT staff for really making this happen. It's an honor to speak to you today. I only have 20 slides covering both of these tools, and I did that intentionally because I really want to have a discussion, let you know, what we don't know, hear all of your perspectives on some of these issues. This is very complex stuff. And so I'm going to focus, as Roseanne and Commissioner Shiroma mentioned, on the ICE calculator effort and a new emerging tool that I think will be of interest to California called the Power Outage Economics Tool, which we have POET as the acronym. So I'm Pete Larson. I lead the Electricity Markets and Policy Department at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. I think probably a number of you know what LBNL is. We are the oldest U.S. Department of Energy national lab, founded in 1933. We're up on the hillside above the UC Berkeley campus. We're managed by the University of California, and we have something like about 4,000 employees, and there's a whole range of activities that take place, research activities that take place up at LBL, including, high energy physics and astronomy. I'm part of a division and a department that really focuses on applied economics and policy work in the energy and electricity space. Roseanne, next slide, please. So the two tools I'm going to cover in this presentation here today, as I mentioned, are the ICE calculator and this new tool, POET, that's under development. I want to start off by just comparing and contrasting these. So the ICE calculator has been used now for a number of years by regulatory staff, by utilities, by academics, by, frankly, people in the media to estimate the costs of what we call short duration power interruptions. And our definition of short duration is typically about a power interruption that lasts 24 hours or less. This tool is very easy to use. It's a website, icecalculator.com, and you plug in some basic reliability performance metrics like SAIDI or SAIFI or CAIDI. SAIDI is the total amount of time that a customer is without power in a year. SAIFI is the total amount of times that a typical customer is without power in a given year. You can plug in some of these values, and the ICE calculator then generates costs of unserved electricity. And this tool is being widely used all over the U.S. It's in a number of regulatory proceedings. And we actually have some users outside of the U.S., as far away as Japan and in Europe and other parts of Asia, actually. But it's used to estimate the cost of short duration power interruptions, but also you can use it to estimate the value of investments in power system reliability. So if you make an investment trying to enhance the reliability of a power system, it's essentially an avoided cost. And so the tool allows you to, come up with those values. The Power Outage Economics tool is under development, and it's going to be, when it's released, a tool that will estimate the full economic impacts of what we call long duration widespread power interruptions. So these are power interruptions that, the ICE calculator is really focused on power interruptions that you might not read about in the paper. The Power Outage Economics tool is really focused on the types of power interruptions that you'll probably read about in the paper. These are power interruptions that span large geographic expanses, including, in some cases, multiple service territories, and are long in duration. They could be days or even a week or more. And when you have these long duration power interruptions, you start to see some really interesting things from an economics perspective. And the way we define, everybody sort of has a different definition of reliability and resilience. So I'm going to kind of refer to some of these terms today, and I wanted to put a definition down at the bottom under each tool. And in our minds, reliability, and this is a quote, I can't remember where this is from, maybe IEEE, but it's maintaining service given reasonably expected unscheduled outages. So these are low and medium probability or likelihood events. They happen, and they have a low to medium impact. Yes, if your power is out, it's a big deal, but when you look across society or communities, it's not a major issue that has repercussions that last for weeks or longer. So-called resilience events, the definition we have here is withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, and naturally occurring threats. These are lower probability but high impact events. You could argue that a lot of the wildfire, the wildfire situation in California, they fall more in this resilience category, this definition, because some of these power disruptions are lasting days and they are spanning pretty large geographic expanses. So that's the two tools. Now I'm going to go first into the ICE calculator. Next slide, please. One more slide. So again, the ICE calculator is a tool that allows users to estimate the costs of shorter duration power interruptions. It's the only publicly available tool of its kind, and it's been based on a bunch of surveys that were conducted quite some time ago. And as I mentioned earlier, this tool is being used to support not only discussions between utilities and regulators about investments and reliability, it's also being used internally by utilities for their own reliability planning activities. And finally, it's been used by a number of different stakeholders, including those in the press, to estimate the economic impacts of past power interruptions. So a couple of years ago, during October, when there was pretty severe wildfire activity occurring in Northern California, I know of some academics that were using the ICE calculator to estimate the costs of those power interruptions, and that information was picked up by not only the local and Bay Area press, but also the national media. Next slide, please. So how is the ICE calculator being used to really evaluate reliability investments? And this is sometimes called in the academic literature reliability value-based planning. And so here's an example from a small utility, basically a municipally run utility in Chattanooga, Tennessee. That, like I said, there are many different examples of this, but this is a kind of a nice one. This particular utility made an investment in switches and sensors on 171 circuits. And there are 1,200 switches and sensors that were installed. And the cost, the annualized cost of this investment was about $5.6 million. They have about 175,000 customers in their service territory, so pretty small. And they were able to show that putting these new switches and sensors in led to improvements in both SAIDI and SAIFI, which are commonly used reliability metrics. And so SAIDI, because of this investment, SAIDI dropped from 112 minutes to 62 minutes, almost in half. And basically, what that means is that a typical customer, before these switches were installed, had power interruptions totaling about 112 minutes in a given year. They cut that number in half for a typical customer. In terms of SAIFI, similar improvement. SAIFI dropped by over 50%. So a typical customer had 1.4 interruptions per year. And after these switches and sensors were installed, the interruptions dropped to just under 0.7 interruptions per year. And they were able to use the ICE calculator to show what was the avoided cost because of these improvements in SAIDI and SAIFI. And when you annualize this number, it was a significant benefit. This avoided cost was about $27 million. I can tell you that after this analysis was completed, a pretty severe tornado struck the Chattanooga area. And our understanding, we heard anecdotal evidence, but our understanding from the utility was the improvement from that single event paid for the investment, the reliability investment the utility made. So just one event, the fact that a number of customers were able to have power, or the interruption was shorter than it would have been had the investment not been made, it more than paid for the investment in terms of avoided customer costs of the power interruption. So this is an example of how utilities are using reliability value-based planning through the ICE calculator. And there are many other regulatory proceedings, and we kind of track them here. If anybody wants to see some of these, I'd be happy to share them, but we track regulatory proceedings where the ICE calculator is cited. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a second ago, the ICE calculator is based on survey data. And what happened was from 1989 to 2012, so as you can see, some of this information is a bit dated, 34 surveys were conducted across the country by 10 different utilities. And we were able to collect 105,000 responses from commercial, industrial, and residential customers. We take those responses to these customer interruption cost surveys and we normalize them, and we basically develop what are called customer damage functions, which allow us to estimate the costs of different length power interruptions. And all we really need to generate the costs of power interruptions for the ICE calculator is SAIFI and SAIDI, or some combination of SAIFI and CAIDI, but you need two of the three major reliability metrics, SAIFI, SAIDI, or CAIDI. You need two of the three, and you can calculate the costs of a power interruption for your state. We report the results by different customer classes and by usage, and we present this in the form of an online tool, icecalculator.com. And as I mentioned a second ago, not only does it calculate the cost of power interruptions, but if you're proposing an investment in reliability, it calculates the value of that investment in terms of the avoided costs because of the investment. So it'll ask you for SAIFI before the investment and SAIFI afterwards, and it basically is able to work out what's the avoided costs because of your investment. Next slide. Now, I'm sure some of you are asking yourself, well, this, or at least observing that this data is becoming old. Some of these surveys, these value of loss load surveys, go back to 1989, and we know the economy has fundamentally changed since 1989. More people are working from home. There's a digital economy now. Electricity usage has fundamentally changed. I know there are a number of utility partners on the call. We know this. This data is becoming dated. We also know that based on where these surveys were conducted, we don't have broad coverage for the entire United States, statistically representative coverage. Now, that being said, it's the only tool of its kind, so people are just using it because that's all they have, and we totally respect that. But now's the time to make a major update. And so with the support of the U.S. Department of Energy and the Edison Electric Institute and a number of different utilities, we're seeking to support the upgrade and update of the ICE calculator. And we're seeking support directly from utilities to do that. Next slide. So we have a number of utilities that have joined this initiative to update the ICE calculator, and it turns out all of the utilities that we have under contract at this point to update the ICE calculator are in the Eastern Interconnection. So we are very pleased with a number of utilities in the East stepping up to the plate, providing support to go out and survey their customers and update the ICE calculator. Through this first phase, we are going to update the ICE calculator for the Eastern Interconnection. And sponsoring utilities are going to get some information out of this effort. One of the things that's going to happen as part of this update is we're going to be developing a consistent set of customer interruption cost survey questions, including, and this is a really important point, supplemental questions to understand customer behavior during long duration widespread power interruptions. So the idea is we're going to issue a consistent set of survey questions, follow a consistent survey protocol across the Eastern Interconnection, and then in the West, that's sort of phase 2, and we'll talk about that in a second. We're going to coordinate the administration of the survey so that we get a statistically representative sample of all U.S. regions and customer classes. And then we're going to update the ICE calculator, update the analytics behind it so it estimates costs of short duration power interruptions more accurately. We're also going to improve the performance and the design of the ICE calculator so that it's easier to use. Here's an example that we heard from an Eastern utility. I actually got a call from our IT staff a year or two ago telling me that somebody was pinging the ICE calculator 30,000 times an hour. And were we concerned? And we did a little bit of investigating, and it turns out it was a utility that was running a web scraper on the website and running thousands of scenarios through it, and then taking the numbers and plugging them into a long-term reliability plan that they were going to submit for regulatory proceedings. We know that we can make the ICE calculator a little bit easier to use for utilities like that. And so that may involve developing like an API or an application programming interface so that utilities don't have to go to the website. They can connect to the ICE calculator behind the scenes. Berkeley Lab and our partners are going to be developing this survey instrument, the questions, conducting the testing and administering the survey, and then updating and upgrading the ICE calculator. Sponsoring utilities are paying for the effort, are going to be helping us design the sample so that we can get a representative collection of their customers. And then they're going to be providing feedback along the way on improvements to the ICE calculator that they think are the most useful. Next slide. So what will this new updated ICE calculator be able to do? Well, first, like I said, the data behind the current ICE calculator is quite dated. So we're going to be able to more accurately value reliability investments or investments that can reduce or avoid interruptions lasting up to 24 hours. We're also going to be taking into consideration feedback from the utilities and a project advisory committee, which I'll talk about in a second, to improve the tool's functionality. And we're going to continue to brand it as the ICE calculator because this thing has quite a bit of brand recognition amongst utilities in the regulatory community. So we want to just reflect that we're improving it. We're not going to call it something completely new. And we hope to ask some supplemental questions as part of this survey of thousands of customers across the country to inform some of the resilience modeling we're doing. And that really feeds into the POET project, which I'm going to touch on shortly. Next slide. So the general public, when we stand up ICE Calculator 2.0, the general public is going to have free online access, just like you have with the current version of the ICE Calculator. Sponsoring utilities will obviously have access to the ICE Calculator, and they're going to have access to some enhanced features, like potentially this application programming interface. We're going to be providing technical support to them. Questions may come up with regulators because we're updating the ICE Calculator. We want to be able to, help the utility explain what some of the updates were and how it's all informed by sound research and development activities by a national lab. And then utilities are going to be given, we're going to basically customize some of the parameters that go into the ICE Calculator so that it's very accurate, as accurate as it can be for a local utility if they're using it for both rate-making proceedings, but also potentially some internal planning. Next slide. So here's the timeline. This looks like it's a long time. It is. This is a big effort. It is, from when we kick this thing off in August 2020 to when we hope to wrap this up in 2024. That's quite a long time. But there's a ton of activity that needs to happen across the country. So we originally targeted trying to get 20 utilities to participate. We've basically got half that number for the entire Eastern interconnection. We were focused on trying to get 2 to 3 per U.S. census area. We feel very confident that we have a representative group for the Eastern interconnection. And my colleagues and I are in contact with Western utilities right now to potentially kick off a second phase of this project, a second wave of surveys out west. We are just finishing up the signing of contracts. We have a number of contracts already signed and funding in-house, and we're just wrapping up contracts with 2 more utilities. And then in June of this year, we're going to be developing these questions, the survey instrument, and the protocol. How are we going to sample so that we get a representative mix of customers across a wide geographic span? And then early in 2023 is when we're really going to be hitting the ground, getting the surveys out in the field. Again, this is going to be thousands and thousands of surveys of residential, commercial, and industrial customers. So this is a tightly coordinated activity. And then starting in June 2023 is when the first reports will be released out for each utility that we survey. And then once we get all of the Eastern Interconnection utilities surveyed, then we'll be updating the ICE calculator for the East. And then in parallel, continuing to press the Western utilities to join the initiative so we can update the ICE calculator out west as well. That's the rough timeline. Next slide. One of the things that we think is incredibly important, and we hope you agree, is we're standing up a project advisory committee. And a project advisory committee is really to be there to follow along with the project's progress as it plays out. We want to be completely open and transparent about this process because, frankly, the ICE calculator is being used to justify billions of dollars in investments across the country already. And we want to have everybody at the table completely aware of and comfortable with what we're doing to update this tool. And so we have a project steering committee, or what we sometimes call a project executive committee, made up of the sponsoring utilities. So each utility has a seat on the project executive committee, but we're standing up a project advisory committee, which is going to be made up of staff from NARUC, NASIO, sort of the state energy officials, NESUCA, the consumer advocates, Edison Electric, American Public Power Association, NRECA, so the rural co-ops, EPRI, and of course the U.S. Department of Energy. We've reached out to every one of these organizations, and at least one staff person has agreed to sit in on the project advisory committee. This project advisory committee is going to be reviewing the consistent set of survey questions to make sure that they're completely comfortable or we're not missing anything. We're going to share with them how we're constructing the algorithms or the mechanics behind the ICE calculator so that they're comfortable with what we're doing. And then we're going to allow them to provide some feedback on how to make it more useful because we know more than just utilities are using this tool. So are there things that NESUCA would like to see in the ICE calculator when we present the results? We'll take those recommendations to the executive committee, the sponsoring utilities, and the sponsoring utilities then will essentially vote on whether to implement some of the recommendations coming forward from the advisory committee. Next slide, please. All right. So that's my overview of the ICE calculator. I'm happy to entertain any questions you have about the ICE calculator.
Great, thank you so much, Pete. I think we'll start with some raised hands and then move to the written questions. Just a note for folks, before you ask your question, please do state your name and your organization, so we have that for our records. The first raised hand is Melissa Kasnitz. You are unmuted. Go ahead.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. My name is Melissa Kasnitz. I'm with the Center for Accessible Technology, and we represent the interests of customers with disabilities and medical vulnerabilities before the Public Utilities Commission. I'm trying to understand if your surveys and your estimation of costs are going to include things like health impacts that vulnerable customers may suffer based on loss of power and thus loss of access to their assistive devices or medical devices, increased risk of health impacts and harms, food loss for customers who are low income in particular and are more vulnerable to hunger and long-term effects from losing the food in their freezer, and these other things that are often left out of sort of a straight, well, if a business is shut down because their systems are out, they lose productivity in X number of dollars.
Great. Thanks for your question, Melissa. So to answer your question, yes. So a couple of fronts. The surveys, and we up on the Lawrence Berkeley National, I'll have my contact information here shortly, but up on the Lawrence Berkeley National website for our Electricity Markets and Policy Department, we have a number of publications that lay out the types of survey questions that are asked of different types of customers. So I would encourage you to take a look at those to get a kind of a flavor for the types of questions we ask. We're not only talking with businesses, but these surveys are going to go out to residential customers. And the questions that go out to residential customers do ask about sort of income categories. They ask about food spoilage. We essentially present different interruption scenarios to customers and walk through with them through a survey instrument. What happens? You know, how much food do you have in the fridge? Are you on, do you have an oxygen at home? Do you have medical devices that need electricity? And you walk through them with them through a survey instrument, all of the potential impacts that may play out when you have an interruption of some amount of time. The way these questions are typically asked of residential customers is they're framed, once you've walked through all these things, they're framed in a willingness to pay framework. And the questions ask something like, if you were offered a hypothetical backup power source, what would you be willing to pay for it? And based on that response, then and some of the information they provided about all the different impacts that they face of a power interruption, we then can generate some of these costs. Now, having said that, when you talk about willingness to pay and then you talk about disadvantaged communities, there's a little bit of a disconnect. And so one of the things I think we're going to investigate with the Project Advisory Committee and the Project Executive Committee is, instead of just presenting the cost of power interruptions, should we present the cost of power interruptions divided by income level so that you see if there's a disproportionate impact based on income? I hope I answered your question there.
You've given me a lot of very useful information. I have a couple of brief follow-ups, if I may. On the willingness to pay point that you were just making, obviously, I appreciate what you're saying, but very low-income customers, it's not an issue of willingness. There's ability to pay, and the ability to pay may be zero or very close to zero. And so I appreciate you saying that you want to look beyond simple willingness, because I don't think that that's a useful metric for the most vulnerable customers who simply wouldn't have the ability to invest in reliability issues. And obviously that's something the Commission is grappling with along multiple lines. The other follow-up, if you could speak to, is like the food loss, whether there's any exploration of like the ripple effects of that, because I could put a dollar value on the amount of food that I would lose in my freezer with an extended power outage, but it wouldn't impact my life in a meaningful way and my kids would not go hungry. Other people might lose the same or even lower dollar value, but the ripple effects on their life and health and safety might be much more substantial, because replacing that food would be a much more burdensome hurdle, if it's even possible at all. And it might have a much greater array of hardship associated with it than, you know, a well-off family that has expensive steak in the freezer might lose a lot of dollar value food, but not a lot of hardship impact beyond annoyance. So is there any effort to take those types of considerations into effect?
Yeah, I think, so when the ice calculator was originally developed, you know, frankly, and this is my honest opinion, is people weren't really thinking about disadvantaged populations. It was just pure, what are the costs of power interruptions? And we have the opportunity through this ICE Calculator 2.0 initiative to report the results in different ways this time around. And one of those ways could be costs divided by income, could be costs divided by different socioeconomic groups. The universe is open about how we can report this information, but in the end, the nominal variable, or the numerator, I should say, is its cost versus something, right? And so that, I hope we hear from our project advisory committee and our project executive committee about what are these alternative metrics that might tell, I think, this much richer story that you're trying to tell here.
Ripple effects, which is obviously very imprecise, but it is things that maybe are less easy to quantify, but create hurdles, challenges, obstacles, whatever word you want to use, for the people who do not have the ability to simply put dollars forward to replace what's lost during an outage.
Yeah,
Great.
I agree.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, for your question. We're going to move on to the next raised hand, Ted Howard. Ted, go ahead. You are unmuted.
Hi, thanks. Ted Howard from Small Business Utility Advocates. We intervene in a variety of CPUC proceedings on behalf of small and diverse businesses, disadvantaged communities, hard to reach customers. Two quick questions. One is following up on the questions that were just asked. Do you consider the concept of diminishing marginal utility, or would you, in estimating the relative value which would be perceived? And for those who don't know what the diminishing marginal utility concept is, it's essentially give $1 to a poor person and this is great. Give $1 to a rich person and they're frankly indifferent. So the higher the income, as this concept goes, and I'm sure you're very well aware of it, the less the value to that customer of receiving that dollar or that benefit or that service. Would you be trying to incorporate that sort of analysis?
Well, I think a couple points on this. So one of the strengths, I believe, of the ICE calculator as it is it's easy to use and it's easy to communicate to audiences of different backgrounds. You know, trying to communicate some more advanced economic concepts like diminishing marginal utility is challenging for a number of different stakeholder groups. Having said that, I think your point is very well taken, and we may be able to address some of this by, like I said to Melissa a second ago, reporting alternative metrics that take cost divided by something, whether it's income, other maybe even non-monetary measures, to try to get at some of the disproportionality that you and Melissa are hinting at here. But you know, reporting utility values, marginal utility values, essentially the happiness that people get from a dollar, it's getting into some somewhat abstract economic concepts that are difficult to even explain to people that have taken economics. So that's our big challenge here, is how do we communicate results from this so that it's understood by a wide audience, but also doesn't leave behind some members of society that are maybe disadvantaged.
I agree, and I know that it's complex, and I would only say that to not at least make an effort would be to implicitly imply a value of 0 as far as the differentiator between low and high income. So I appreciate your efforts. I know how challenging that is. So I'll move on quickly to the second question, which is just, if I understood you correctly, there are no Western utilities that have taken up the ICE. I'm wondering if I understood that correctly, and specifically in California, the 4 large IOUs, are any of them utilizing ICE? What feedback have you gotten, if any, from them?
Yeah, so we do know the California utilities are using the ICE calculator. One thing I can tell you that's maybe a little bit more unique with California than some of the other utilities is that what we found is that there is some stovepiping. There are parts of the utilities that are using it frequently, and there are the parts that we would have thought have been using it that aren't using it, and they're not necessarily aware of each other's experience with the ICE calculator. But that's true, I think, for a lot of the biggest utilities, and California has some of the biggest utilities in the world, frankly. We are in discussions with some of the California utilities. My colleague Joe Edo and I have presented this ICE calculator update initiative to them over the course of the last 6 months to a year. I am reasonably confident that one or more of them will join at some point. I think the fact that we got all the Eastern to join was weird by chance. We're a Western national lab, but it just turns out that the utilities that jumped first were the East, and we just kind of rolled with it. Once one utility, and I can't name them yet because we haven't officially announced it, but once one utility joined, then they called up their buddies at the utility in the next state over and said, you guys should think about joining. And then all of a sudden it was kind of a snowball effect. And we're hoping that that happens in California and other states in the West. But we're having some active conversations with a number of utilities, including those beyond California out West.
Great. I think it would be of great value. It's a wonderful tool, and I think it would be very important for them all to participate, and I hope they do. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Ted, for that question. We'll take one more raised hand. Just a reminder to folks, if you've had your question answered, please go ahead and lower your hand. And if you have another question, please raise it again. We'll take one more raised hand question and then move on to written questions. So next question is from Lorenzo Christoph. Lorenzo, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Hi, thank you. Two questions. One, when you talk about California utilities, are you also talking with the big municipals, especially LA, DWP, and SMUD, or just the IOUs? And I think that's an important distinction because the example you cited of Chattanooga, we know, is a municipal utility. So, and in fact, a somewhat famous one because when they did their major investment in grid visibility and so on, automation, they also leveraged that into providing community broadband to their entire territory, broadband internet access. It's a really interesting model. But I'm just wondering if also SMUD and LADWP are using the ICE calculator today, and are they candidates to participate in your project?
Yeah. Thanks, Lorenzo. I don't know for certain if SMUD or LADWP are using the ICE calculator. We'd certainly like to get some of the more, the public power, the rural co-ops to join the ICE calculator. We targeted the big IOUs first, just because for two reasons. They have big geographic coverage, large populations, but also the cost of joining. And so one of the things that my colleagues and I are talking about is there a slightly alternative business model for us where we can get some of these smaller utilities that may have some unique challenges and some different types of customers to join the initiative at potentially a reduced rate? It is very expensive to survey customers and get statistically representative samples. That's the vast majority of where our costs are. So we hope that we can find some rural co-ops, not just in California, and public power, organizations to join. That's one of the reasons why we asked APPA and our ECA to join the Project Advisory Committee, not only just to keep them in the loop what we're doing, but hopefully they can communicate to some of their members that this is happening and that they might think about joining.
Yeah, that sounds good, Peter. And
Lorenzo?
Yes?
Real quick, before you proceed, can you state the organization you represent as well?
I'm sorry, yes. Lorenzo Christoph. I'm a consultant with the Climate Center. A follow-up to the thread that Melissa and Ted have been asking about. I'm wondering if there's any potential demographic bias in who responds to the survey. And I'm wondering how it's administered. For example, you talked about walking people through a survey. well, many low-income households may not even have the time or capability to respond. And so that could be biased results as well. What's your thought about that?
Yeah, so a little bit about how the surveys are administered. In this ICE calculator update effort, residential customers are going to be contacted through multiple forms, through email, but also through snail mail. The plan is they're going to be given a pre-incentive amount. A residential customer that's selected to take this survey gets $5 in the mail as a pre-incentive. They don't even have to take it. But we found that providing them with that, you actually see a higher response rate than if you say, hey, we're going to give you a check later. So residential customers are going to get a check in the mail, whether they complete the survey or not. They're going to be contacted through multiple forms. The intent is to work with utilities to statistically sample from across their service territory. So we're not just focusing on wealthy areas. We're getting a mix of different incomes in terms of businesses, of different types of businesses, and located in different places. So it's a very concerted effort to get a statistically representative sample of the population, because we're pulling information about the population in order to inform the sampling.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pete, for that. With that, I'll turn it over to Roseanne for any written questions.
Thanks, Julianne. We have one from Sam White. Will the results be weighted by region? For instance, residential customers in one region may realize different costs than a different region for a comparable outage. So similar to the question that you just answered, but perhaps there's some nuances there.
Yeah, and developing essentially the equations behind the ICE calculator, there's certainly going to be weighting based on, the sampling and so forth. We're pooling groups of different types of customers: residential, small industrial, medium and large industrial, and commercial. And so, yeah, there is going to be different types of weightings, but I can't tell you right now what those weightings will be until we actually see what the data looks like and what the samples look like. But we're not trying to skew the results to one region or another. We're just trying to develop the most statistically robust model of customer interruption costs.
Thank you. And actually, just to ask a follow-up question to that, in terms of weighting, it's been noted in the past that the costs to commercial and industrial customers might be reflected differently than residential customers. Does this calculator take that into account? That's my question.
So yeah, the calculator reports results for 3 different customer classes. Those definitions of the customer classes may change slightly based on the feedback from our project executive committee, because they're essentially the decision-making body. But right now it reports results by small, medium, commercial, industrial, large, commercial, industrial, and residential. When you're talking about economic impacts, and this is going to hold true for ICE Calculator 2.0, the economic impacts are always going to be larger for non-residential customers compared to residential customers by orders of magnitude. We ask, as I mentioned a second ago, we ask kind of willingness to pay like questions for residential. For the non-residential customers, it's a much more complicated survey. In fact, it's an interview with the large customers that's conducted. And we ask about costs, lost productivity, workers sent home. We also ask about savings, because we know some businesses actually save some money during power interruptions. And we then net it out to come up with the net cost to that business and then aggregate up. So I hope I answered your question there.
You did, thank you. Next question is from Gina Kim. Will surveys be administered in languages other than English to adequately incorporate data from linguistically isolated communities who also experience some of the greatest impacts from outages?
That's a great question. I believe I can double check. I know that the surveys are offered in different languages. I would have to check on how many different languages. I believe Spanish for certain, but I can double check and get back to you, Gina.
Sorry for the pause, trying to find my mute button or my unmute. Okay, so we'll make a note of that to respond later. Lee Kamerich asks, does the ICE calculator quantify or estimate ratepayer impact for resilience investments that is utility specific? Or does the ICE calculator estimate the total cost of a specific project to achieve resilience?
The answers are no. The ICE calculator really just estimates the costs of power interruptions to customers, or the value, essentially the societal value of an investment in reliability. If a utility is proposing, let's say a $10 million investment to underground a 5-mile stretch of line, the ICE calculator, and I've written papers on this subject on the costs and benefits of undergrounding, but the ICE calculator can help estimate some of the benefits of undergrounding in terms of avoided costs to customers in terms of power outages, but it's not intended to estimate the costs of that investment in undergrounding and how it may play out in terms of rates. We have other tools that do that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Paul Chernick asks, you might consider asking some questions to get at willingness to be compensated. How much would it be fair for the utility to pay you if you experience an outage of? Or questions like, would you rather have backup that would avoid this outage, or $30 per year discount on your electric bill?
Yeah, so really good question, Paul. So the willingness to accept and the willingness to pay has been kind of a long-standing debate in the economics community in terms of these types of surveys for a number of years now. We have under contract Michael Hanneman, who's a longtime professor at UC Berkeley, one of the world's foremost experts in asking these types of questions in a way that minimizes bias. And the thinking is that willingness to accept creates more bias than asking willingness to pay questions. And so based on review by Michael Hanneman, but also a number of other experts, we're sticking with willingness to pay, but we're doing some sort of mechanical changes within the willingness to pay where we basically present ranges of numbers and ask them to react. We don't just have them fill in a number.
Great, thank you. Let's see. One more question from Kristen Rounds. Does the survey account for customers that already own some sort of self-generation? For example, if a grocery store or residential customer have solar and storage installed already that they can utilize during an outage, are those responses accounted for in the analysis?
Yes. We do ask questions both in some of our short duration power interruption survey questions, but also some of the longer duration stuff that we're doing with POET and other projects. We do ask about backup generation. We ask if they have it. We also ask how much fuel do you have on hand and how long can you run it. That's especially important when these long duration power interruptions start playing out. And you can see that some of these questions have been asked in the past in the current version of the ICE calculator. If you go to the ICE calculator website, there's a little gear icon that allows you to play around with some parameters. There's an assumption that X% of customers in your state have backup generation. And so if you're in there, you can fiddle with that number and see how the results change based on the share of the population that may have backup generation or self-generation, which can include, solar and batteries or, a fossil-fired unit.
Great, thanks. We have one more question in chat that was sent to me privately, so Roseanne, you may not have been able to see it. This from Jessica Melms, who asks, are all utilities who participate considered sponsoring utilities? How much does it cost to participate for rural co-ops compared to a large IOU?
Right. So the large IOU, the buy-in on basically a survey activity in your utility is $600,000. And I know for our friends at some of the smaller utilities, that's a number it's too much to bear. The cost of $600K is actually a huge savings over what it typically costs. And then, like, if an individual utility wanted to go off and do this on our own, we work with, some of the organizations that have been conducting these value of lost load surveys for decades. They may charge you $800K or $1 million if you're a large utility. So we've gotten the cost down to $600K, but I realize that that's potentially too expensive for some of our smaller utilities. And so if you are a smaller utility and you are on this call and you are interested, I would encourage you to reach out to me, because these are and I think Lorenzo kind of spoke to this question a second ago. These are the types of conversations we want to have with you. We're not going to need to survey as many people if it's a small utility. And so we may be able to get the cost down potentially significantly and still have you be able to participate and get your data in and give you a customer interruption cost study out of the work.
Great, thank you, Pete. And with that, there's no more raised hands that I can see.
Thanks so much. Just check and see if there are other questions. I don't see any others, but Pete, I do have a couple of other questions that I didn't hear you address, and I just wanted to bring this up. How often would the ICE be updated with customer surveys? Would this be the only time, or will they be sort of like a redo?
So phase 1 is going to be the Eastern interconnection, one shot. Phase 2 is going to be the Western interconnection. And by the time we get all of them in, phase 1 and phase 2 completed, I envision restarting the process again with the East. So a couple more years. We probably give it a couple of years between sort of the start where we're kicking it off, like literally now, and it's going to take some time to 2024, 25 to get the whole thing updated across the country, and then we'll restart. That would be my goal.
And we have one more minute before I wanted to get to the next section, which is the poet. And I just wanted to know if you could say a little bit of something about why you think that this tool in particular has been so widely used over some other models. There have been other economic models that have been developed to estimate costs, but this one seems to be the one that is most widely pointed to and used among other across all the utilities. And I know some of the other ones are still in pilot stage, but can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Well, I think it's widely used because, as I think I mentioned earlier, it's easy to use. It's all you got to do if you really want to generate numbers. I can estimate cost of a power interruption literally in like a minute. I can go in there, plug in a safety value, plug in a SAIDI value, pick my state, boom. It outputs the results quickly. We try to post all the documentation up on the website. So I think that's one of the ways there's been uptake. I think a lot of the utilities that were among the early surveying utilities, the ones that provided the basis for the ICE calculator, they kind of got the process. They remember the types of questions that were asked. And so when it came to making a tool, we were using their data with their, cooperation, of course. So it wasn't like we were just creating something out of scratch. It was based on something the utilities and regulators approved in other places. And then I think the third thing that really led to uptake was just the adoption in a couple of utilities that got it in front of regulators And then once one regulatory or, one set of commissioners basically approved its use in a rate proceeding, then it was game on. And it was happening, one utility in Florida was citing somebody up in Virginia, and Virginia was citing somebody up in New Hampshire, and it turned into kind of a snowball effect. But I think that's more a little bit of luck, but it was people needed the information, and once one got approved to use in a proceeding, then others cited it, and then others cited those, and that was kind of how it kind of blew up. That was my sense. But my colleague Joe, who's been working on this longer than I have, might have a better perspective on the history.
I think that's really helpful. And I guess one other thought that I had was, well, actually two questions. You mentioned that you post the documentation on the website, and you also mentioned the schedule for the results of for the utilities. Will there be access for the utilities participating to some of the raw data or the data that's coming out of the surveys that they can work with as well?
Yeah, so those are things that I think we're going to have discussions with each individual utility bilaterally on. We're going to be getting really detailed customer responses from all these sponsoring utilities. We're not going to obviously share one utility's data with another because we have individual contracts and non-disclosure agreements in place with each utility. But yeah, if the utility comes to us and says, hey, can you give us the raw data from the survey? I don't see any reason why we wouldn't give it to them. They're paying for it. We're just going to process the data into a nice format so they have it in a report they can use for whatever purposes they have, and then we're going to use it to update the ICE calculator.
And in California, we have public safety power shutoffs, which provides some customers with notification. So it tends to be somewhat of a difference between planned and unplanned outages. I think you might have alluded that to a little bit in your presentation, but can you talk a little bit about whether the customer surveys will be addressing this difference?
Yeah, so most utilities are not dealing with some of the situations that the California utilities are dealing with public safety power shutoffs. We're going to be administering a consistent set of questions across the country. One of the things that we're going to allow every utility that joins is the opportunity to add a couple of supplemental questions at the end. So there's going to be a core set of questions that everybody gets in order to calibrate this thing. But every utility is going to be given an opportunity to ask a few questions that they may have concerns about or something they really wanted to know about. That would be the opportunity for our friends at the California utilities to insert a few questions around PSPS. Because then we can basically, because it is somewhat unique in the US, chances are we're probably not going to ask PSPS-like questions in all of the surveys. But for the utilities that care about that specific issue and the regulatory bodies that care about that specific issue, this would be an opportunity to add those questions as supplementals that go out to all the customers in their service territory.
Thanks so much. And I know we're going a little bit over time with questions, but I think it's a rich conversation. And there's one more question in the written, which is from Ben Wender. Are infrastructure interdependencies reflected in the tools at all? Potential impacts to communications infrastructure or natural gas? Thanks, great work.
Thanks, Ben. Not explicitly. The POET tool, which I'm going to touch on here in a bit, does get into interdependencies among or across economic sectors. So the ICE calculator is really focused on what would customers be willing to pay for a hypothetical backup service. And then for business customers or non-residential customers, what are the costs of the power interruption in terms of lost productivity? Any savings associated with the interruption? Did you purchase insurance? So it doesn't really tease out the interdependencies that we obviously know exist. The POET tool, though, starts to get into some of these issues because it is looking at basically trade amongst sectors of the economy. So that's actually a perfect question to segue into the next part if you want to go that way.
Let's do that.
Okay. So POET is a brand new emerging tool. It's not even fully ready yet, but I wanted to share it with you because I think it is important, and it is a piece of the puzzle in terms of valuing investments in both reliability and resilience. We don't even have a fancy logo yet. That's how new it is. We're going to be making a fancy logo here shortly, but it really combines the best of both worlds. It takes survey responses talking to actual customers about their resilience posture, and it takes regional economic models and it puts them together and spits out a comprehensive impact analysis on the economy from a long duration widespread power interruption. In the past, long duration widespread power interruptions or any natural disaster, frankly, there's been a handful of techniques. Some people will do surveys, or some people will do an input-output model, or some people will do a computable general equilibrium model, or a GDP, all these different models or surveys. What we're trying to do is take the best of both in what we call a hybrid valuation framework that uses survey responses to calibrate economics models. And that's what POET is all about. And so next slide. So Roseanne and Julian had asked me to throw out some discussion questions right up front. I'm not going to answer these right now, but I want to just put them out here so you can kind of think about them as we go along. And if I don't answer them, definitely, use the chat or whatever to submit your question. But I'll tell you that, like I said, this is an emerging tool. We're hoping to get results from the model here later in the summer and the fall. And if we're successful, and I'm confident we will be, I think this is going to be a game changer in terms of putting a value on resilience, at least from an economics perspective. All right, so next slide. So as I mentioned a second ago, this is what we call a hybrid resilience valuation approach. We're using survey-based techniques to identify behaviors that both businesses but also residential customers take to reduce risk before, during, or after a power interruption occurs. And then we're taking regional economic models that basically take, capital, labor, energy, and produce outputs, economic outputs, and we're shocking those regional economic models with a power interruption, and then we're looking at, well, how are customers telling us they might respond, and we're able to calibrate this model and generate more realistic numbers. In the past, regional economic modelers who have focused on natural disasters are what we've found, and we've written papers on this, is they're pulling assumptions, frankly, out of thin air about customer behavior. We now have the opportunity to ask customers, how might you respond if a 3-day power outage happens? And based on those responses, then we can calibrate some parameters that go into this model. And so some examples of the types of questions that are asked of customers are, how much are your costs reduced by shifting the time or location of your production? Hey, you have a 3-day power interruption? Your Tesla, can you shift your production to next week? Can you shift your production to somewhere outside of the Bay Area? How much were your overall costs reduced by having backup generation or batteries and storage and solar? We can get at some of these responses and then use them to calibrate regional economic models. And the regional economic models then spit out changes in revenues, also known as gross output, changes in producer or consumer prices, electricity prices, prices of different commodities, changes in net economic output, and then changes in labor supply and demand. And we do this by throwing long duration, widespread power interruption scenarios at these customers and asking them, how does your business, what would happen if there was a 1 week power interruption? You walk through a scenario with them. And this method allows us to estimate both the direct and indirect impacts of power interruptions. And so direct impacts, think of the ICE calculator. That's really direct. It's like, how much did the power outage cost you? Indirects, and this is speaking to, the question we had right there at the end, indirects are, hey, what are the economic impacts of customers downstream of your business and suppliers upstream? And those suppliers or those customers may actually have power. So, for example, if you're Tesla, you have a direct impact because of a power interruption, and hopefully Tesla has power because of the business they're in. But if they didn't, there might be some direct costs to Tesla's factory. There may be indirect impacts to customers of Tesla who are relying on a vehicle for their catering business, but that customer may actually have power. And then there are suppliers to Tesla, maybe Michelin tires, who are impacted because they can't get the tires to the factory because the factory doesn't have power. Those are examples of indirect impacts that we're able to measure with these types of models. Next slide, please. So we pitched this idea of a hybrid valuation approach a couple of years ago to the Department of Energy. And unfortunately, the DOE, the Department of Energy, didn't have funding at the time to support what we were looking to do. But a utility got wind of the idea, and this was Commonwealth Edison, which is an Exelon company. Commonwealth Edison serves greater Chicago, basically northern Illinois. And Commonwealth Edison basically came to us and said, hey, we're pitching microgrids in our service territory, and we're getting some questions from our regulators about the value of these microgrids. And we heard that you're thinking about piloting a tool to estimate the economic impacts of power interruptions or the value of improving resilience. And we said, well, yeah, would you like to maybe sponsor us and we'll go after a project together? And Commonwealth Edison said, yeah. And so they have funded a project piloting this technique that I just described. And this is the geographic resolution that the model is going to output when we're done calibrating it. They are focusing on a number of different regions. We're sampling 3 different regions. So we're going to be conducting statistically representative samples of Cook County, which is basically Chicago, a group of suburban counties, the 2nd through the 8th row here, and then a group of rural counties in Commonwealth Edison service territory. And then we're going to be generating economic impacts for all 14 different regions listed here. So Cook County, we're going to have economic impacts of power interruptions. We're going to have a slew of suburban counties, and then a cluster of rural counties. And then because Chicago and the greater Chicago area is a world trade hub, Commonwealth Edison wanted to know, hey, if there's big power interruption in this part of the country, what does that mean for service territories adjacent to us, or the rest of Illinois, or Wisconsin, or Indiana, or frankly, the rest of the United States? So we're able to estimate both the direct and indirect impacts that ripple through not only Commonwealth Edison service territory, but a much broader geographic expanse. Next slide. In terms of sectors that we're going to be studying, there are 17. We're going to be looking at economic impacts of these power interruptions to ag, forestry, fishing, and hunting, mining, and then you kind of go down the list. I'll point out that there are a couple of different sectors of interest that were pointed out to us by the utility. The utility was really curious what would happen to the natural gas sector. So the question earlier about interdependencies, this is a perfect example. The utility had questions about interdependencies. They want to know if there's a power interruption, what's going to happen to natural gas distribution, that sector of the economy. Water, sewage, and other systems, another interdependency. Motor and generator manufacturing. They were really curious. Hey, is this going to lead to an uptick in business activity for our generator manufacturers if you're starting to show long duration power interruptions? And then there's some other sectors of interest that we pulled out that they agreed that they would like to see deeper analysis on. So not only are we going to be showing a number of different regional impacts, but a number of different industries, how basically economic activity changes because of a long duration power interruption. Next slide, please. This is the remaining number of sectors. There's 17 on the first slide, 17 here. So 34 sectors by basically 14 regions. That's how many different variations of geographic and sector resolution that we're going to be spitting out economic activity on. All right, next slide. So this project was launched about the same time as the ICE Calculator 2.0 initiative. We've been developing the survey instrument, the sampling strategy, and we've been conducting some modeling dry runs over the past year or so. I'm happy to announce that we have a full survey out in the field. We're done with pre-testing. There are a lot of customers in Commonwealth Edison service territory who are seeing surveys right now. We're starting to get responses in for both residential and non-residential. We'll be processing those results later this spring into the summer and then running the model under different interruption scenarios. And then we'll be releasing a report, and then the goal is to develop a pretty basic tool that ComEd can use. They basically select an outage scenario, and it shows how the economic activity changes because of that interruption scenario. And the idea here is to develop a tool that's simple and easy to use, like the ICE Calculator, and potentially house it on the ICE Calculator website as sort of a sister tool. And then in the future, we'd like to run this type of analysis for other parts of the country now that, with a little bit of luck, we'll successfully demonstrate this with Commonwealth Edison. Next slide. So Roseanne and Julian had asked me, you know, if the California stakeholder or utility was interested in doing something like POET, what's the timeline for something like this? The good news is that because of this project with Commonwealth Edison, this piloting, we have a survey instrument that we can work with that's been vetted by a number of experts. So it's essentially 3 to 6 months after the kickoff of a project, we could have a sampling strategy in place. We could come up with what sectors do we want to focus on in California? How do we want to break this down in terms of California geographies? Is it counties? Is it different regions? That would only take 3 to 6 months. And then 9 to 12 months is really pre-testing the survey instruments and then the full survey administration. Surveying these customers takes a couple of months' time to get the appropriate response rates. And then processing the responses, running their model. So this is a 1 to 2 year project, depending on how complex we want to get. But once it's done, when you have an updated ICE calculator focusing on direct costs of short duration power interruptions, and you have a POET tool that estimates the direct and indirect economic impacts of long duration power interruptions, now you have a very powerful suite of tools that can help you evaluate investments in resilience, notwithstanding some of the questions we talked about earlier about disadvantaged populations. We're still going to need to address those issues somehow and present their information in a way that doesn't leave those types of populations left behind. So out of this project, if we did something in California, we would still develop a simple online tool akin to the ICE calculator, and then we would obviously generate a report detailing how we went about this, what the survey responses said in terms of aggregate responses, and then showing some of the results in terms of economic impacts. This is really targeting non-residential customers because it's business activity. we have been piloting and executing long-duration survey instruments in Guam, Prince of Wales Island, Alaska, Cordova, Alaska, Tok, Alaska, and Haines and Skagway, Alaska, just within the last year. So we are pioneering some new survey instruments for residential customers to develop damage functions for longer duration power interruptions that could be repurposed for California and updated for California. Next slide. And I think that's it. So here's my contact information. Joe Edo, longtime colleague. His contact information is up here. Many of you may know Joe, but feel free to call me, send me a note anytime. I'm always happy to answer questions about this stuff.
Great. Well,
Great, thank you so much. Jillian, do we have any questions or hands raised? I don't see any questions in the Q&A.
Yep, we have one hand raised and one chat question. So we'll start with the raised hands. Just as a note for folks, please state your name and your organization before you rattle off your question. So the raised hand I see is from Ted Howard. Ted, go ahead, you're unmuted.
Yes, Ted Howard from Small Business Utility Advocates. As contrasted to the ICE model, the POET model is a longer term model. I'm wondering what term you use. Is that left to the utility? And then is it also left to the utility to determine what discount factor over the period of time, such as discounting, time value of money sort of calculation, whereas the argument would be, since these are public benefits involved, that it should be the lower discount rate. The lower the discount rate used, the higher the value paid on future benefits calculated by this model. Maybe the T-bond rate is a good estimate of what that public benefit would be versus the utility's overall cost of capital, which is typically used in rate case proceedings to determine the time value of money. So just wondering what your thoughts are generally on how you would take account for that over a longer term.
Yeah, great question, Ted. So on the time frame, so the ICE calculator, we're really presenting scenarios in front of customers on the ICE calculator up to 24 hours. So we throw them, maybe a momentary interruption, a 5-minute interruption scenario, a 6-hour, a 16, and a 24-hour. So they'll see a handful of scenarios and we ask them questions. On POET, for Commonwealth Edison, they wanted 24 hours, 3 days, and they wanted a 2-week power interruption. And not that they thought that there would be a 2-week power interruption, but they wanted to know, like, worst case scenario, absolute worst case scenario, cyber attack, whatever it is. They want to know what the impacts would be if there was a 2-week shutoff. So that's on now, if California utilities wanted to pursue a POET-like model, and we'd love to work with them and your regulatory staff on this, that would be up to them to define what are the long duration scenarios that you think would be most useful to understand the economic impacts. On the discounting question, for the ICE calculator, that's a parameter that the users, I told you can do 2 things with the ICE calculator. You can estimate the cost of power interruptions or the value of an improvement in reliability. One of the inputs on the value of improved reliability is, essentially the discount rate. So we're really leaving it to the users to specify the discount rates they want to use to justify an investment and let them argue in regulatory proceedings why they think they should use that rate. We don't want to be in a position of picking the rate.
Great. Yeah, that makes sense. And I guess there may be also, because these impacts could go longer term. So I guess in these proceedings that could be debated, just what is the appropriate term period that these ripple effects could have, including any economic multiplier effects. I'm wondering if you have any of those, income multiplier, job multiplier, other estimates in the model.
Yeah, so the POET is based off a computable general equilibrium, or a CGE model, developed by Ian Sue Wing at Boston University and Adam Rose at USC. So it's basically solving for prices and quantities. It's not an input-output model. We've just published a paper not too long ago arguing that that type of regional economic model is preferred over any other, the CGE model like Ian and Adam have developed. But yeah, it takes a while for some of these ripple effects to clear the economy. And so, yeah, those are things that, you know, we're going to have to communicate in our methods when we produce the ComEd report and potentially follow-up studies for other, you know, users of POET down the road.
Great, thanks.
Great. We also have one question that showed up in the chat. This from Daniel Drazen, who asks, do your surveys and or calculations consider the ability of some backup generation to provide demand response power back to the grid and generate revenue for the host facility?
Great question. You know, frankly, I don't think we ask about backup generation. We ask about solar and storage. I'd have to look. Let me get back to you. Was it Daniel? Let me get back to you or reach out to me. I have to look at the detailed questions for Commonwealth Edison, the POET project, and potentially some of the questions we're developing for the ICE 2.0 to see if there is a question about actually selling, you know, basically providing a resource, an ancillary service to the grid. I don't know if we ask something like that, but I think it's a great point and something we might want to ask.
Great, thanks, Pete. We also have one more raised hand. This from Jim Zolik. Just as a reminder, please state your name and your organization when I unmute you. Jim, go ahead.
Great, thank you. Yes, my name is Jim Zolik. I'm with the Schatz Energy Research Center at Cal Poly Humboldt. And thanks very much for the presentation today. My question regarding the POET model. So you're talking about long duration outages, you know, on the order of a couple of weeks. And so, you know, one of the scenarios that we have the airport microgrid project here up in Humboldt that we're just about to go live with in terms of islanded mode capability. And one of the scenarios here for our region, and actually this happened back in the flood of 1964, is that was, you know, major flooding, but it could happen with a major earthquake and tsunami and things like that as well. We're pretty isolated here. You know, there's only a couple of highways that come in and out of the county. So it's not unlikely that we could lose transportation access in and out of the region. And the only way to get back in the flood of 64, the only way to get supplies in and out of the area and even around the area, because it was so devastated throughout the region, was basically by helicopter and aircraft. And so the operation of the regional airport and the adjacent Coast Guard station is really critical to our region in the event of a major natural disaster like that. So I'm just curious, you know, you've talked about the economic impacts to all these different sectors. I'm curious in a long-term sort of natural disaster outage like this, how you factor in, you know, basically deaths and injuries and things that, you know, a lack of emergency response that, you know, it could be due to you know, lack of communication capabilities with no power, or lack of transportation capabilities without power. So just curious, I don't know if that would make, how much of a you know, an economic impact that would have compared to the business outages that you're talking about, but it does seem like an interesting thing to ponder. Thanks.
Yeah, great point. And I like that point because it just, you know, what happens in these events is much more than just a power outage and lost economic activity, right? It's you're impacting people's livelihoods, you're impacting people's health and safety. And so POET and the ICE calculator don't account for these types of values. It's, you know, purely costs to customers or lost business activity. I have worked on a number of other projects in this space where I have looked at investments in reliability and resilience and how they may actually reduce risk to livelihoods. And I'll point out one. So I do a lot of work up in Alaska, and we just finished sort of a draft paper on the costs and benefits of a resilient distribution system that Cordova just put in. And I think Cordova, it's a beautiful place, but it should be of note to California because Cordova was one of the first communities I ever came across that's 100% underground. All of their power lines are underground. And I ended up writing a chapter of my dissertation on Cordova on the costs and benefits of their decision underground. And I accounted for improvements in reliability, but also improved health and safety because the lines are underground. And that's not an insignificant number. And since their undergrounding initiative, Cordova has been installing even more sophisticated resilient distribution systems with automation and cybersecurity protections and batteries. And so we were asked to do a cost-benefit analysis of that project in Cordova. Same thing. We learned from the stakeholders that these investments, they felt like if a natural disaster struck, like you're describing, Ted, if a natural, or maybe it was Jim, I can't remember who asked the question, but sorry. If a natural disaster struck, the the health and safety benefits would be significant, and you can put a dollar value on them in terms of basically the risk, the chance that an accident happens multiplied by different costs of injuries and health. You can also take the chance of premature death and multiply it by the value of statistical lives saved. So we have done or completed techniques to estimate some of these other value streams that you're describing. And I apologize if I got your name wrong there a second ago, but so these tools that I described here today don't account for that, but we have other methods that we have used and published that account for some of these values, and I'd be happy to share those with you.
Great. Thanks very much. Yeah, the name was Jim, but yeah, thanks very much. I appreciate it.
Great. With that, I think that's the last of the raised hands. I think there's a question in Q&A, Roseanne.
There is a question in Q&A. Gina Kim asks, do you know about the RenCat tool being developed by Sandia on quantifying community resilience? Are there plans for how such a tool or similar community resilience quantification would be incorporated into POET?
Yeah, so I am very familiar with RenCat. It's developed by, or it's been developed by some of my colleagues at Sandia, and Bobby Jeffers, who's now at NREL, but a longtime colleague. I talk to him basically every other day. It's a small crew who sort of do economics and social sciences around resilience. I don't believe we'll ever fold RenCat into POET or vice versa. They're two very different tools, but some of the work that Bobby and his colleagues are doing in this space, I think, is really innovative in terms of getting at some of these things that got raised on the earlier part of the call about social burdens. And really, when we go to the Department of Energy and we pitch project ideas, Bobby and I are usually, complementing each other in our presentations, because I talk about the economics and Bobby really handles a lot of the social stuff, including sort of the disadvantaged populations. And so we view these tools as complementary of one another, and we often pitch them in a complementary fashion to funders, in that he's really getting at this social burden that can be lost if all you do is fixate on the economic impacts.
And that's a great lead into our next workshop, which will be held. But before I announce that, I just want to check in to see if I know that there have been a lot of other questions. Oh, and there's two more in the chat. But I just want to put it out there. I'll ask these written questions, but just kind of curious as to whether any of the IOUs present on this call have any comments or questions on this effort. This would be a great chance to ask. Meanwhile, I have a question from Katie Ramsey. She says, I share the concern about incorporating health and safety values. Peter, could you share those tools you mentioned with the group?
Yeah, they would be tools. They're more papers that we just published on. When I've done comprehensive cost benefit analyses on undergrounding power, I've done the cost benefit analysis on undergrounding Texas and Cordova, Alaska, and then we did a cost benefit analysis on a resilient distribution system up in Cordova, Alaska. Those are papers. Two of the three I can share. The third one's out for final comments, and as soon as it's back from comments, then I can share that one too. But they all document how we're able to show that you do see health and safety improvements because of investments in reliability and resilience, and then you can monetize those.
Thank you. And Sam White asks, would you say that RenCat is more for mitigation value optimization as opposed to POET total cost benefit?
That is a great question. So can you repeat that again? It was mitigation. I heard the first part.
Yeah. Would you say that RenCat is more for mitigation value optimization as opposed to POET being maybe a total cost benefit?
I would say, I think that's probably a fair statement. I have to be honest with you. That's one I probably need to think a little bit more about. But my initial reaction is the outputs of POET more nicely fit into a cost benefit framework, neatly fit into a cost benefit framework than probably RenCat. But I'm not diminishing the value of RenCat. RenCat is equally important. It captures some of these things that are very difficult to include in cost benefit analysis, but should be considered in a decision around investments in resilience. So I'd have to probably give your question a little bit more thought about the minimization versus cost benefit, but I can just tell you when you put an economic value straight up on resilience, it fits nicely or easier into a cost benefit framework. But RenCat also serves a very important purpose in terms of thinking through these complex decisions around resilience and reliability.
Great, thank you. Julian, are there any other raised hands?
Yes, we do have one more raised hand from Tam Hunt. Tam, go ahead, you're unmuted.
Yeah, hi, Tam Hunt, consulting attorney for the Green Power Institute. Peter, great presentation, really interesting work you're doing. And in terms of the time frame to develop a tailored POET tool for California, 12 to 24 months, I know is, I think pretty reasonable given kind of normal regulatory timelines. But given the severity of PSPS events in California and, the possibility they might get worse, would there be a way to advance that time frame if deemed really necessary?
Yeah, I think what we've experienced working with our utility partners, and it's been awesome. The last few years of my career, I've pretty much gotten most of my money from either Department of Defense or Department of Energy. It's been really fun working directly with utilities because you just get a different perspective. But I can tell you that, working with utilities, one of the things that's time consuming, and my friends at the utilities would say the same thing, is getting access to customer information and to be able to survey is a difficult, nasty process. It involves cybersecurity. It involves, having non-disclosure agreements in place. And so, I just try to report a timeline that is based on my experience. We don't want to, shortcut some of that stuff, but I agree, some of this information is needed now or actually yesterday. But in order to get the right information to do a statistically representative sample, being able to get that data from a utility in confidence and protect it's a time-consuming process and not something that we want to, shortcut because it's, involves real sensitive data about customers that we could never release. Sorry, it was a non-answer, but it's the constraint we face.
Understood. And I guess a follow-up, in terms of the steps after obtaining the customer information, I think I probably know your answer here, but I mean, is there a way to accelerate those timelines so that it could be, a year or less? And because also when you say 12 to 24 months, knowing how timelines slip, I imagine that could easily become 3 years under kind of a normal quote unquote process.
I think now that we've piloted Poet with ComEd, or we're in the process of piloting it, that's something where we could probably shave time down. We know how the model works. We know the types of questions that we want to ask, more or less. We know how to calibrate the model based on once we get these responses back. So I think that could be somewhere where we might be able to trim some time. I always just try to set the bar low and exceed it. We never like to set the bar too high and come in short. So my philosophy with the research I do is always try to set the bar low and exceed it. And that timeline I put together was trying to sort of set the bar low and exceed it. But I do think we could probably shave some time on the tail end of the project as opposed to the front end, getting the cybersecurity stuff in place.
Got it. Thank you.
With that, I don't see any more raised hands.
Yeah, and let's see. Gina Kim says, is there an effort to quantify social burden such that it can be included in POET? I'm concerned that unquantified costs and benefits not included in POET will not be considered in agency proceedings, etc. And Gina, go ahead.
Go ahead, Roseanne.
Oh, I was just going to say, Gina, your question might be answered at our next workshop, which will be on RenCat. But go ahead, Pete.
Yeah, one thing we don't want to do with POET is make it everything for everybody. We want to really, make this a tool that's trying to produce a very specific needed piece of information with the understanding of the user community that this is one piece of information, that there are other pieces of information that definitely need to be included in these decisions, including social burden, including health and safety. So we're really trying to hit out of the park one specific piece of information we know is desperately needed. But we're also hoping that other researchers and other regulatory staff and utility staff consider some of these other, impacts in the decision-making process, and they're not making the decision solely on economic values.
And I think that is all of our questions so far. Thank you so much, Pete. I really want to thank you. I very much appreciate your time and expertise and all the work that you're doing on developing these tools. Really, really great to hear about them in more detail. And Commissioner Shiroma, would you like to say some closing words?
Thank you, Roseanne. And thank you so much for your presentation of the tools. And I think the, both hold great promise for what you're doing to update the ICE, and then also in terms of the pilot and for the POET, and in terms of tools that can really help utilities and regulators like ourselves to prioritize efforts to really have an ability to look at the overall costs. Very much appreciate the participation. And the comments I thought were very very good, very apropos, and thank you for the folks who did weigh in. Utility may have anything to say today, If not, there will be other opportunities because we do want to hear perspectives on the overall practicalities. Thank you, and back to you.
Thank you, Commissioner Shiroma. So foreshadowed by our last few questions, our next meeting is tentatively scheduled right now for July 15th, continuing on the theme of economic inequity impacts of large disruptions, and it will be Sandia Labs' presentation of the Resiliency Node Cluster Analysis Tool, or RENCAT, and how it can lead to development of a social burden index, which is basically how hard people have to work to get their needs met in the event of a power disruption. So we look forward to seeing you there. I will confirm that date with an announcement to the service list. And if you have any questions, you may contact either myself or Julian, and the materials to this will be up on our website. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining.